not there yet, as you probably noticed.
Okay.
The pictures that are coming up now first are Dr. David Yandell and his brother. Now
And
those are
this
the,
is David,
right,
and this is Lunsford.
yeah, and his brother, Dr. David Yandell and his brother Lunsford. Those are the two,
And they're
those are the
both
three.
doctors.
They're both doctors. Now Dr. David was the chief surgeon for the Confederate Army of the West,
That's
and
this
Dr.
man.
Lunsford was the chief doctor for the Confederate Army of the West. But between the two of them, when slavery was abolished, they were the first to liberate their slaves in the family plantation, which was Craggy Bluff, down near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And they later formed the only free clinic for colored people known in the state at that time, and possibly altogether unknown excepting in Kentucky. And they were the ones, and they also founded Transylvania Medical School down in Lexington, and also the Louisville Medical College. And so much for those.
Okay.
Mhm. And then here comes a picture of Aunt Maud Yandell. Maud Yandell was one of three sisters, of whom Lunsford Yandell, my father, was the only boy, and his father died at 48. He was a minister, a Presbyterian minister, as well as a doctor.
And that is this man.
And that is that man right
Okay.
there.
This man had
Four.
4 children? 5 children.
He had 4. He had a son who was very much spoiled by his mother, my father's father rather, and he also had the 3 girls,
And this is one of them.
and they did their share of spoiling too. That's right.
And this is another picture of the
That's
same man,
right.
father of
Right.
this one of 4 children.
You
Now,
can-
Maud, while we have Maud up at the camera, you want to tell some stories about her?
Well, Aunt Maud was very much given to the study of Oriental religions, so much so that to father's dismay, she would recommend that everyone go out and walk in the early morning when it was cold in bare feet on the grass. And she became converted to a form of the Mohammedan religion called Baha'i. She had a lovely character. Everyone loved Aunt Maud, and she was given to giving everything away that wasn't screwed right down tight to the floor, and that, of course, was considerable worry to my father, who was responsible for her worldly affairs, what was left of them. And she went to England because she was dissatisfied with the increasing materialism in this country in 1914, and never returned as a resident. She became a resident of England. She unfortunately suffered later in her life from delusions, one of which was that Winston Churchill was very much in love with her, and that meant that she had to be placed in a home that would take care of people who were unfortunate in that way. And then she was moved to Cheadle Royal, which was established by Queen Mary, I think. And she said that some of the finest minds in England were in Cheadle Royal, so that it didn't dismay her to be there. And she had a whole collection of small treasures. All the nurses that I remember were Irish, very kind, lovely Irish girls, and they would put out all her little treasures. And they told me one time there are 3 crowned heads, women crowned heads in England, but there's only one Miss Maud Yandell. And that's the impression she made on people. And can you imagine any little boy submitting to those clothes, which were my early costume? There is grandmother, my
This is her mother.
grandmother.
Is that right?
That's right. That's
Okay,
right.
so this is
That's Louise
her father.
Elliston. That's Louise Elliston. That's right. That's the family. Louise Elliston. She was raised in a big house down in Nashville, Tennessee, called Burlington. The man who built Burlington was later mayor of Nashville, and he was a silversmith. And the Elliston silver is very much in the South still, as the Tiffany silver is in New York. And he had, in consequence of his connection with silver, all of the doorknobs, all of the knockers, all of the what would be normally ironwork on all the 3 floors of Burlington were silver. And they now still exist because one of his daughters married a banker who had the wherewithal to build a house, because Burlington itself, the big house, became a part of the Vanderbilt campus, which it still is. And I think that's all that perhaps I can add to that particular picture. These are Grandmother Elston with parts of the Barber family. One of the daughters married a man whose name was Don Barber from New York.
This is Don Barber?
Right, and down in the left.
So
And
one of Maud's sisters.
that's right. One of the 3 sisters married Don Barber.
For
who-
some reason, she's not here.
That's right.
But this was her
mention-
husband, and
That's
this is
right.
her brother, my grandfather,
Right,
your father,
And that's myself.
and that's you,
And
Uncle
that is,
Lunsford.
the Elliot, the member of the Elliot family that grandfather married. In other words, it's on the back.
Okay, but now we have,
Yeah, it's coming out.
Is it
That's
good?
clear.
You can
Is
see
that
what's
pretty
going
good?
on. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this, I'll have to take a little closer look. This is father, your grandfather, right?
right,
And these 2, Aunt Maud is sitting what I firmly believe was in a mud puddle, which wouldn't have bothered her at all, so long as she could sit cross-legged. And these 2 are her 2 sisters, I believe. Let me just take a quick look. Yes, they are. That's Aunt Enid, and that is Willis Davis, and that is his wife, and she went to college at Bryn Mawr with my mother. And consequence of that was that she invited Mother down to a house party, and that's where he met the man here,
mm-hmm,
right?
okay.
That is clear.
So that's how they met. Oh, that's very interesting.
Mhm.
Okay.
And then
Now, could you, what was it about,
Aunt Maud.
Maud? There was a story I was hoping you'd tell. No, I
Well,
think you told the stories about her.
I
Okay.
think maybe I
let's-
did.
Okay.
This is
No, I know what it was.
Okay. What?
You told me once that Maud started a rumor, or there was a rumor that she liked, that there was Indian blood in our
Yes,
family.
Yes, it was a romance that I think occurred rather in her mind than elsewhere, that we were related through Pocahontas
Mm-hmm.
with one of the early figures in American history, whose name I can't recall what it was.
I think
but
it was Captain John Smith.
It could
who
have
had an
been, it
affair
could have
with
been, but I have never found
Indian.
that was authentic.
But
That was Aunt Maud rather than being all factual, I think.
Okay.
Anyway, it's nice to think of.
well, just put the
Now, let's-
rumor with the face.
Let's go ahead. This is a very small picture, obviously, and here is a much better shot, excuse me, of the same thing. Hope you needed to hold pictures up.
Okay.
This obviously is the same small boys as in the hairdo, as it were.
This is the firstborn child of
That's
my
right.
grandfather and
That's
grandmother,
right.
Uncle Lunsford. And this
Well,
is
that-
at the first house in Kentucky,
Yes.
which we're gonna find,
No,
probably
no.
under the grape arbor, it looks like.
No, I don't think that was the first house. It's hard for me to tell with so little showing in it.
Mm-hmm.
But I rather think that that is the grape arbor, and I think it was probably the first house.
Because when
It
didn't
almost
you,
has to be
you
the
didn't
first
move
house.
until you were a little bit older.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, before he was married, his uncle Breck Castleman, of whom there's a more than full life statue down in the Cherokee Park in Louisville, but by Enid Yandell, he was assigned to come down with him to Cuba to be in the Spanish-American War by his uncle Breck Castleman, greatly to his mother's dismay, who she promised him that if he came back alive, or if he would come back alive, she would give him a farm, as if he had much control over that. He did come back alive. He only suffered the misfortune of being kicked in the stomach by a mule because he was in charge of mule transport. And it was a pretty active job because the way they unloaded mules, for example, fighting the hostility on shore was to sling them over the side, drop them into the water, and they knew that they'd lose a certain high percentage to sharks, but the rest of them would be used to pull cannon artillery on the shore.
Mm-hmm.
He came back alive, and he was given a little farm down outside Danville, Kentucky, 5.5 miles outside, and he paid little colored boys $2.50 a week to pick up flat limestones and make walls out of them. And one of those little boys was named Mose. Now we're
Shall
going
I
to
see if we
pause
can
until
find Moses' picture?
until we get to Mose. Yes.
Okay.
So you can just
We're gonna
stop
take a
filming
little
for
break.
a moment. As my grandmother saw it, there was a certain coldness on her side because he schemed to take her son away from her to war. And he was a very well-known man, and there's a beautiful life-size statue by Enid Yandell of him in Cherokee Park. And would you cut again right now, Ross, so that I can get a little bit more collected?
We're looking for Mose, though. Well, we'll come back to Mose. Do you wanna do that?
Let's go ahead with Mose while we're on the subject of the farm, because it's kind of a nice story. It's him standing between.
Okay, we'll
I
start
think
with
the
this
last
one.
thing we spoke of was one whose name was Mose. We
Right.
mentioned Mose.
Your father came back from the war alive, much
Yep,
to his mother's
that's
pleasure.
right, and he got a little farm, and the flat rocks were picked up by colored boys paying $2.50 a week, and one of those was named Mose, and Mose was so trustworthy. The picture shows him with two of the favorite mules, Matt and Mandy, and when Father had to go away on business for a week, he left Mose in charge. He was the kind Mose was the kind of man that could be left in charge. And when he came back, he said, "Mose, how have you been?" And Mose said, "Oh, boss, ain't been doing no good." "Well, why not? You had plenty to eat." No, sir, he said. "I ain't had nothing but eggs." Well, bless his heart, he wouldn't go off the place to get anything to eat other than eggs, and he had a sort of a greenish yellow color, and he survived to one of his things, which was a misfortune for me, was to catch my finger in the door, a big door of the mule barn, and it's never been quite the same since. But it had nothing to do with Mose. It was my fault. I shouldn't have been crawling in the direction of the mule barn anyway. Now let's see who we do next. Cut.
Okay.
And now she's coming into her own, largely through the efforts of a lady who's the librarian of the University of West Kentucky University down south of Louisville. And one of her best known pieces of work was Daniel Boone in Cherokee Park. Another was a portrait of her mother, Louise Elliston, who's a beautiful likeness. She studied under Gutzon Borglum in Paris. She was a member of the Beaux-Arts, of course.
Can you see that, Ross? This woman?
And she also studied under, or rather she was tutored by Rodin, who was the famous sculptor in England, of course, who did The Thinker. But she did monstrously large pictures, or rather sculptures. One of them is in the square in front of what was the railroad station in Providence, Rhode Island. And she's been being recognized more and more as one of the really great sculptors in this country. As a sculptress, she had a peculiarly unique position. And I think we'll cut again there for a moment.
I could have a quick picture of this because by now I can sort of tell who most of these people are. So you got it rolling?
Shoot.
Yeah. Okay, this is my grandfather, and two of his sisters are present, maybe three. This is Enid that we just saw the
Right.
sculpture of. This is Maud, who has
Right.
not yet left for England, never to return.
Correct.
And
Oh,
then
she
that-
made visits back, but she didn't
Uh-huh.
stay to live, you know.
And this is the sister Elsie.
Yes.
Is that her name?
Yes.
And this is her husband,
Don Barber.
Don Barber.
A very prominent architect in New York who did, not that this was his best work, the Yale Bowl, and a number of the very fine houses both on Connecticut and in Long Island, private houses, and talented musician. And they had, of course, the one son and two daughters.
Now, are these their two daughters?
Right.
Okay, so the son is not yet born.
Right. The one on the left is Betty,
Mm-hmm.
that little girl, and this is Louise, the younger of the two, and Don had not yet arrived upon the scene.
Mhm.
This is my mother, your grandmother.
Mhm.
And I'm again dressed for I don't know what,
Okay.
but there we are, cut.
Right.
Father, being a horseman by nature as well as by lack of schooling, was determined that his son, his first son, and probably possibly his only son, was going to be oriented toward horses. Well, now the reason he didn't have adequate schooling was because that in those times he had a very serious case of dyslexia, which was simply not recognized. So when he didn't do well in school, schools that were able to handle difficult children were found, and one of them was Bell Buckle School down in Tennessee, at Bell Buckle, Tennessee, and it was run by a man named Sawney Webb, who had a spade beard, a red spade beard, a bald head, and a passion for Greek and discipline, truthfulness.
Hmm.
And he used a bait switch to enforce the part about truthfulness. And as to the educational side, he was very strong on Greek, and there were more Rhodes Scholars at one point from that little school in Bell Buck, Tennessee, than from any other school in the country.
Hmm.
But Father couldn't make it, so he ran away. And the third time he ran away, he stayed away, and that was the extent of his education at 14. Always a great humiliation to him, especially since in Greenwich we lived right down the street from close friends, Dr. George Vinson of the Rockefeller Foundation, who was an educator to end all educators. Father suffered from a feeling of inferiority all that time, but when it came to business or horses, he rose and soared above anyone else in Greenwich, and that somewhat made up for it. And when we first came north, he was unable to really make it in the north, having sold his farm on account of having to handle the affairs of his mother, my mother's uncle, who was the source of the three girls' money, what they had. He had to sell his farm, and he simply had to have his horses and his hounds, so he moved to Greenwich. And there he was master of the hounds. But going back to his education, when he ran away from the Bell Buckle School for the last time, he went to refuge offered him by his uncle Maxwell. His uncle Maxwell raised trotting horses, races, and Father made an arrangement at 14 with his uncle Steve Maxwell that every 10th colt he broke, it was his. So in due course, without having too many disasters on his horses, he had a string of horses, and he proceeded to race them at the age of 15 on the tracks in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, and he did very well indeed. And I had not progressed at all in my fondness for horses because I had, I guess, too much put on me. But by that time, I was trained in the driving of trotting horses. And it's great fun if you can stand the output of on a wet track of mud in your face and all that. But
Goggles.
yeah, but and goggles of course help. But that was the way he began his horse career, and I disappointed him by not being a horseman particularly, although I had to ride 5.5 miles to school after milking every day in a brake cart with a big heavy cart that the horse couldn't kick apart, you know. And
Is that why they were named a brake cart?
yeah, that's right. It broke horses without being broken up itself.
Ah.
A very simple arrangement. Let's cut again. Okay. On the ponds, the stock ponds, and the cut ice and stored it in sawdust in an ice house. You feel me?
Yeah.
In an ice house, and every so often one of the tragedies of my youth was to find that a pig had fallen down into the ice house on the sawdust and starved there.
Oh boy.
And that to me was a great tragedy. Undoubtedly was for the pig too. So,
So you wanted to tell a story that you remembered about
going to town and coming back.
going to school in the brake cart, and
Right.
you had to drive yourself
All right, now let's get that story
5.5 miles every day, back and forth to
after
school
milking.
after milking.
Right, and I drove to a school called the Kentucky College for Women, which was somewhat of a humiliation, but they also had boys and girls together in the early parts. And I was driving usually a horse, an ex-polo pony, whose name was Buck. He was a beautiful buckskin horse, and I was strictly forbidden to race him, which of course was not a prohibition that was always observed, because you couldn't be challenged and know you could win and not accept the challenge. But anyway, during the course of those drives, frequently there were convicts in chain gangs under guard, with leg irons, which were such that you couldn't run without knocking the leg iron in front of your next step, and you'd fall flat. And they didn't attempt that more than once or twice, because it was a bloody business. But they would be standing on 4 corners of a square, driving one steel into the limestone in order to allow blasting to take place. And all the roads were white limestone. And the thing that I struck most by was whenever there were pigs being driven to the neighboring Harrisburg to be shipped, the pigs would always stop at wherever there was any of that drilling going on, and the 4 men would strike the iron absolutely accurately and sing in time with the iron.
So they go around in a circle.
Bang,
With a
bang,
sledgehammer.
bang, 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 bang. 4 hammers going, 1 man in the middle, holding it with his hand. I never saw them miss the steel once. And if there were pigs, the pigs would be so fascinated with what was going on that you could hardly get by. But I didn't want to get by. Anyway, I was forbidden to stop and talk with the chain gang. But you couldn't help that, and you know, their race is so kind that they would, I usually have a dog or more than one with me, they would want to stop and anything to stop the hammering. But the modern song, 16 tons, is exactly what went on those white limestone roads to get ready for blasting. I think we can cut again.
Do these, and you just say what each one is.
Wait just a minute.
Can you see
I can
them?
see if I can recollect which one is. These are all pictures, go ahead and film. These are all pictures having to do with the Negro cabins that were around or near the house. And at the time that my father was running the farm, the principal, we never raised tobacco. The principal crops were wheat and corn and livestock and hemp. Now hemp was the same as marijuana, excepting on a much different scale. It was a shorter thing, and it had long, long stalks, and the fibers were made into manila rope, and hemp rope rather, and they were later supplanted by sisal, and that killed the hemp industry in that part of the country. But there was a distinct sweet smell which was over those fields, hemp fields, when the pulp was burned, which was the result of breaking the stalks that were dead dry then, and then burning the pulp and putting the stalks in what looked like long hanks of hair. And they were what rope was made of. And just as a recollection as to what happened, there were always numerous little Negro boys, because the hemp field was cut around and around and got smaller and smaller, and everything that lived in the hemp field, particularly baby rabbits, were forced to find somewhere else to live. And as they ran out, I and my little colored friends would chase them, and you could easily run them down on foot, you know. And that was what we did. And then they were about as good on the table as anything I can remember. So these pictures are simply the cabins that they lived in. And some of them were absolutely fantastic physical specimens. I remember one, Will Gayton, who could take a 200-pound sack of grain and standing on the back of a truck, pop it up into the top, into the loft where it was stored, without apparently any difficulty at all.
Trying to do it all day.
And I think we'd better cut again there, so of those. Now here are some little family shots, you know, but it's hard to identify them. That was one of the old mule barns down here, one of the old mule barns. There were 3 mule barns, and they were dispersed over the farm. What happened was the first farm my father added to, he added the Mock farm. The Mock farm had one of the oldest distilleries in Kentucky, producing a bourbon called Old Mock. and he didn't enter the distilling business, fortunately, and he cut the big tanks into cattle tanks, and under the limestone slabs, which were the steps down into the cellar of the distillery, they found a dozen bottles of the first brew, preserved miraculously because it had corncob corks, and the corks were cemented in.
My God.
But you couldn't stand more than just a couple of whiffs of that and still stand. We'll cut again. That's, you know.
And why don't you just describe, just say a little, we'll just go
Well,
right through
that's
this
the old
file.
original Hughley house. That was the original farm that Father got in reward for coming back alive.
And you
That's where
told me
Mose took charge.
Mose ate eggs for a week
That's
so
the
that
man.
he didn't
We
leave
ju-
the place in
We
case
just put that
anything
down.
happened.
That was
Okay.
in Moses'
But
name.
you also told me you were born in this room.
Well, I was born, delivered by the doctor, who was the son of the famous Dr. Dahol, who took a grapefruit-sized tumor out of a woman's womb with minimum anesthetic, nothing but chloroform, and she lived. And that made medical history. His son delivered me on the kitchen table, and we returned, my mother and I, to this little bed, which is what I now sleep on at 91.
Oh my goodness.
So you can see it was a durable bed made in those days. And incidentally, just as a little side issue, you can cut on that, I think, Ross. My role model was taken from the writings of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr., and he had quite a gift for poetry, and he wrote a poem called The Wonderful One-Horse Shay, and it ran like this, and this is my role model. Did you ever hear of the wonderful one-horse shay that was made in such an ingenious way that it lasted for 100 years and a day, and then, in an atmosphere of mild decay, all at once, it fell apart, all at once, nothing first, just like a bubble when it burst. So I hope that at the end of 9 years more, I will be like my role model, falling apart.
Going for 100.
Nothing first, exactly.
Okay.
And I think we can cut there while we fry.